My name is Susan Banki, and I am privileged to be the Director of the Master of Social Justice here at the University of Sydney, and also the Chair of the Discipline of Sociology and Criminology. And very much in the work that I do, I'm always interested in the why of social justice. Why do abuses to social justice occur? And what are the means that we can figure out how to try to address those? And for today's seminar, or workshop or webinar, we are really delighted to have three terrific alumni that will be talking about the work they've done. Before I launch in and ask them to introduce themselves, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional land on which we meet. For me, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. For those of you who are zooming in from other places, it may be from other places in Australia. I want to particularly acknowledge the elders, past, present, and emerging, that we honor and that we hold, that are custodians of this land, and that we hope we can say with confidence today and going forward that this is land that is sovereign and was never ceded. So with that, I will start my introduction. So there's been a little bit of market research that shows that if you have a panel discussion and the panelists go on for too long about themselves, then people get bored. So we are going to do the opposite of that. What I'm going to ask each of our panelists to do is to introduce themselves and just to do a really quick, for starters, introduction about themselves, 1 or 2 sentences max. And then after that, we'll launch into some different questions that will allow you to talk a little bit more about yourselves. So the order in which we'll go, just for starters, is starting with Indu Balachandran, and then we'll go to Marcus Campbell, and then we'll go to Zoe Robinson. So what I'd love is for you, Indu, to begin to say a few things about your work and maybe some highlights, some things that have really excited you about what you've done. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Susan. Hello, everyone. So my name is Indu Balachandran. I suppose I've been thinking about, I have a broad remit. I work in social enterprise development. That's probably my core area of work, alongside very much elevating Indigenous voices and knowledges. My background's in finance, political economy, and more recently in social change. So I tend to work in roles that are strategic, that actually shape the social impact of an organization, but very much also building viable models, financially viable models that through which these values can be created. In terms of a highlight, one that I'd like to share is probably I co-chair an organization called Community Resources. It's an environmental services social enterprise, a national one. We employ 700 people. We deliver waste and recycling. And what's interesting about this for me at this stage of my career is that I've had to put aside leading an organization from the inside as an executive to very much taking a helicopter view and building foundations of an organization, governance, risk, finance, strategy, that ensure that our people and work are happy and healthy and can endure today and are robust, but also that they will endure and be happy and healthy for an unforeseen future. So that's probably one, the kind of shift from management to governance has been a really interesting highlight for me.
I love that as a highlight, Indu, and what it really kind of reveals is that the many different ways that we try to enact social justice, whether that is kind of being on the ground and kind of delivering the materials that people need, to strategic thinking, to governance questions. So I love that you've highlighted that. Marcus, welcome. Would love to hear from you now.
Hello, everyone. I'm Marcus Campbell. I'm the Communications Manager for Uniting World, which is the International Partnerships Agency of the Uniting Church in Australia. As a partnerships agency, we partner with communities in the Pacific, Asia, and Africa for programs on poverty alleviation, gender equality, disaster response, and climate action in response to what the partners want to do. We support them, we fundraise. In I guess my communications background gets applied for mostly fundraising, telling stories to donors, then also advocacy, which I'm really passionate about. I've been here for about 7 years now in a few different roles, but I'm particularly passionate about the advocacy work that we get to do alongside of our partners. An example of that, which is a highlight for me, was we often bring out Pacifica leaders to do lobbying in Canberra. So we link them up with politicians to kind of give them the direct from the source, I guess, issues and challenges that they care about. And I was at an event where both Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese, when he was opposition leader, was about to speak. And I was able to catch the Albanese before he was going to go up to speak, because he was kind of drifting around and things. And I introduced him to a leader from Kiribati, and she got to the quick chat to him about how climate change was this existential crisis, and also the challenges to facing women and achieving gender equality. So she had this really great, like almost 3-minute elevator pitch to him, and he got up to each, and he literally quoted, 2 of her main talking points. So it meant that Albanese kind of blew Scott Morrison's talk out of the water, because he had that direct connection. And all of the other Pacifica communities there were like, whoa, he knows his stuff, sort of thing. But it was really the connector piece that did it. Another highlight for me was being able to travel through West Papua to meet some of the people who my master's research was based on. Got to do a few interviews, got to see, I guess, challenges affecting the people, and then talk to a lot of the people that I'd only ever emailed and, talked online and things. So got to meet them in person, and yeah, that was really mind-blowing for me. And I got to do that, I guess, through my role at Uniting World, which was great too. So yeah, that's things that stood out to me. Hopefully I haven't gone over time.
No, those are great examples. And I love the win that you had as a communications director, having the communication come directly from the source to the person that can most effectively broadcast it. If that's not an effective communications director, I don't know what is. And I have to just say, bragging, I'm so proud because Marcus is my former student. So I'd love to think that I somehow played a role in helping to get you to that place. Speaking of former students, I'd now love to introduce Zoe Robinson, who is another one of my former students.
Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and those that are with us. So on paper, I am one thing. I've done law degrees, communications, and obviously my Masters of Human Rights. But I'm a very fortunate person. So as a result, I would say that my role is the opportunity to bring voices of those who often aren't heard into government. And so I work with government, but I'm an independent statutory officer, which basically means I'm not party aligned. And my job is to make sure that children and young people of New South Wales are heard in government. So that's complex in so many ways, but I guess in terms of wins, a lot of our wins aren't very public. And so one of the ones that I hold dear to me is a young man who's in a youth justice centre who hadn't actually connected with his mother for about 8 weeks, and she was in another correction centre. And that seemed really straightforward to me because we knew where both of them were, but for some reason we weren't connecting them. And so there was probably another 8 weeks of trying to figure that out. But as a result, he now has regular video links with his mum. And so they aren't necessarily public ones, I guess, but for me, they're those kind of behind the scenes wins that are really important. And then I think perhaps the time that I got a call from the Premier's office to ask for advice, and they took it, which means that you didn't see the announcement that they were going to make.
That's wonderful. I wish I could ask you more about that announcement, but my guess from the way you just told that story is we're not allowed to know it. But Zoe, you've just underscored something that I think is terrific and potentially a sobering but really important part of what we know to be about social justice work is sometimes it's about doing the paperwork. It's about following a legal trail to connect a mother and a son. It's about answering a call from the Premier's office to say, well, my research would indicate that this is going to work, and so that this is not going to work. And yeah, for those of us that have done social justice work, and frankly, for those of you who have done it, because I think I'm speaking with 3 marvelous panelists that have more experience than I do, it's gratifying that it can also be quite invisible. So I really appreciate that you brought that up. All right, well, now we've had a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to ask the next question with the hopes that some of you watching have watched Ted Lasso, because there's this terrific moment in Ted Lasso. It's the dart game. And if you have not watched it, I will not give it away. But there's this part in Ted Lasso where the main character talks about curiosity and the importance of being curious. And I was really struck by speaking with all three of you beforehand about how you seem to get to what you are doing because you were curious about something. So there's two mini questions I'd like to ask of you, kind of fitting them all together. What sparked your curiosity? Sort of what got you into what you're doing? And then if you don't mind, if you can, kind of building that in from something that you did at the University of Sydney, that's really useful because the people on this call are potentially either alumni or currently at the University of Sydney, and I think it helps them to connect. So why don't we go in a different order? Let's do Marcus and then Indu and then Zoe for the next question. Thanks.
So I did the Master of Human Rights program back in, I think it was 2011, so quite a while ago now. And one of the highlights for me in that program was a simulation exercise that focused on a conflict or a human rights situation. And the year that I did it, it was West Papua focused. And at the time, I didn't know that much about, I guess, West Papua and the conflict, but the simulation exercise helped me understand that better and really open my eyes to what was going on. And yeah, I guess the not knowing was the curious bit to me, like, how is this going? How is this happening kind of so close to Australia? And I don't know much about it. But then the simulation exercise, I felt like a bit more equipped to kind of understand the dynamics of social change and the different actors and the different, I guess, like power plays and power struggles. But then also like how you can make a difference within like being an actor, within like having, you know, particularly if you have some sort of organizational affiliation or you like have a group that you can kind of identify with and then take action collectively. And for me, it was kind of, you know, I grew up in the church, have a bit of a background there. I'd kind of moved away from it, I guess, like during my time at the master's program for different reasons. But something that brought me back was the Uniting Church has a partnership with the biggest church in West Papua. And I found out the kind of work that they were doing was really great and formidable, but then also quite rare. Like, it's rare that you have an organization that has an affiliation with West Papua. So I was able to approach, like a job opening came up, which I applied for and didn't get. But they said, oh, you've got this communications background, you have this human rights experience. Would you consider this other role? So I was just keen to work there and do whatever. So because they worked in West Papua, and I was really interested in kind of continuing on that journey. So yeah, that was the thing that sparked the curiosity and then like led directly into where I am now. And I get to keep working in that space. Something that's coming up is we're bringing over 2 West Papuan young women leaders to do some lobbying in Canberra. So I love that I get to like be involved in that and help make it happen. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much, Marcus. And again, not to be kind of summarizing everything that you are all saying so articulately, but one of the things that strikes me about your story is that there was a place, there was a specific location that interested you, that captured your, I was going to say imagination, but it's really your reality. And you thought, as by the way, I think many people in Australia feel, how is it possible that I did not know about this? It is in Indonesia, it is the closest country to us. So I do want to say to our participants, do not feel bad if you do not know about what's going on in West Papua, because it is really quite confusingly understudied. But there are places that you can learn about it at the university, but I don't want to spruik too much. But I am just saying that often people's interest the curiosity is sparked by a particular place. And the other kind of thing that I want to draw out of what Marcus has just said is that it was a little bit of a weaving path for you to find yourself. It's not like when you were in the program, you said, you know what I want to do? I want in 10 years to be working in an organization that will allow me to bring West Papuan women or Pacifica Island women to Canberra to allow them to be in a situation of power. And yet we find ourselves that way through our curiosity, which is, of course, why I asked the question. And what a great segue to Indu. I'd love to hear your story about curiosity now.
Oh, thanks, Susan. I studied the Master of Economics and Social Science, which was through the political economy faculty. It's probably nearly 20 years ago. And I suppose, it would probably be, I wonder if the audience would find it interesting to hear about what got me into that program, because that was probably the beginning of my shift in careers. So I started my career in corporate finance, and I really enjoyed the work. I had great colleagues. There were probably a couple of moments in my work in that sector that bewildered me a little bit. I remember there was a time I used to read The Big Issue. I still do, the magazine that you see on the streets that the homeless people sell. And I remember bringing it to work one day, and I dropped it on the table for everyone to read. We had a magazine table, and one of my colleagues, said to me, you can't bring your kind of social issues into work. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because, I was curious as to why it was a very large organization, was not inquisitive about system and economy and society within which we lived, which we're all integrated with. And the other thing was I lead quite a strong cultural life as a person of Indian origin. I wear Indian clothes to work, and I did even then. It was a property company, and it was actually incredibly uncomfortable to do that. There was just the environment I was in was not, and I still think there are many work environments where it's I could wear Indian clothes, I wear a dot, and people really don't know where to look or what to make of you. And I think there were these moments of unease that made me think, well, let me explore other ways of living where one doesn't have to compartmentalize oneself. Where life, work, home are not separate. So I actually went off and spent a year in India. I was very interested and positionality is probably another area of curiosity for me. Who am I? Why do I do this work? What lens do I bring into this work? How does that make my work stronger, and how does it make my work weaker? And the year in India was, I spent a year working in women's services in rural and then urban India. And it was magnificent because I spent a whole year with all kinds of women in India who were rural women, urban women, women like me, women not like me. We had lots in common. We had lots that were not in common. But I learned a lot about solidarity. I learned a lot about engaging with people who were similar but different. Engaging with people in different languages. And I think that positionality has always served me well. And it's one that I continue to be really interested in. My last role was with the Aboriginal Housing Office, and before that in the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence. I've worked in Indigenous, with First Nations communities for a very long time now. And it's really important, I think, this question of positionality. Who am I? Why do I do this work? What is my role? And, I see myself very much as a temporary entrant. And I've always left Indigenous successors in the roles that I've left behind. And that's part of, I suppose, my obligation to my position in this work. I have skills, I have a cultural lens that is actually quite valuable in that sector. But there is work that should and can be done by First Nations people. So, I think that interest in personal positionality and being able to be myself and continue to explore who that self is in the context of social justice work is a really important one. So I think that really drives how I do the work I do.
I thank you, Indu. That was a marvelous way of thinking about this idea of positionality, which I just want to say, when I was younger, we didn't really have that phrase. So for anyone listening who is kind of wondering what that is, it's not something, again, that one should feel like, oh, I should know what that is. And Indu's actually just described it so terrifically that I don't really need to repeat it. It is something that we certainly do in our master's programs now, is to talk about positionality. And of course, it's not just for Indian women or women from Indian descent. It's for white women. It's certainly for white men. It's for every possible person to think, what do I bring to my role? And what is my agenda that I may not even be aware of when I go in to do social justice work? So for me, my father was a refugee. And I'm sure that's the reason that I started to become interested in refugee issues and migration issues. And interestingly, quite the opposite of Marcus, I got into the West Papuan issue because I was interested in the West Papuans that had left. So, you know, we come at things through our position, which is this point you make about positionality. So I love that you brought that up. I definitely want to return to ask you something about your work in Indigenous communities, but I do not want to neglect Zoe. I'd love to hear your story of curiosity.
So mine is from very young. My dad, who is no longer with us, but was a great best friend and supporter of mine, used to always say to me, you can have a view so long as it's something that you've got experience in, for want of a better example. So he was always encouraging me to have thoughtful debate and informed debate. And also, I just have to acknowledge that for me, I do come from great privilege. You know, I went to the same school for 13 years. You know, I guess the big trauma in my life was losing my father. And so for me, I really do have to embrace the get comfortable being uncomfortable. So I do need to be curious about other people's experiences. And I've always been that way. And I, as Susan knows, I'm a big fan of To Kill a Mockingbird. I have a dog called Scout and one called Tom Robinson. So it's well and truly in my life. And so I always had this various view about capital punishment. And so my dad was of the view that it's easy to have that view in Sydney, Australia. And so I did the thing that I don't think he thought I would do, and packed my bag and moved to Houston and worked on death penalty cases for the defence side, just in case that wasn't clear. And so as a result, I could do that through my Masters of Human Rights. And that was the wonderful thing about Sydney University. There is a part where you could do actual, immersive experiences and being exposed. And my wonderful tutor at the time was like, well, we haven't done this. So I'm going to Houston, so let's try and build it. So the curiosity is how I get the job that I'm in, because I recognize who I am and what my background is. And so I know that I need to be consistently asking questions and asking why, but also asking what matters to other people. And so I think that's what has worked well into when I got asked by the governor to do this job. It was because I'd asked why a lot and I hadn't assumed answers. And I certainly didn't come into the room with solutions.
That's a terrific reflection on how we are formed early on. So we can't all just either blame or credit the university, but from so many different places. And speaking of curiosity, one thing I forgot to mention at the beginning to everyone that is here today is that we will open up the floor for questions. There is a Q&A box. And if you are curious about anything that you have heard, please make sure to put it in. We will make sure that there's time at the end for questions. We're not up to that yet, but I do want to encourage those of you there to really reach out. You can ask a question of all three or anyone specifically. I'm going to actually add in a question that I hadn't thought of, but you all three have mentioned it, and I thought it would be worth asking. You've all mentioned the component of traveling. So Zoe spent time in Houston, Indu spent a year in India, and Marcus has done a lot of research in West Papua. I too was a person that early on in my social justice meanderings did a lot of traveling, and that sort of sparked my social justice research. But I'd love to hear your honest reflections on what does travel do for the social justice soul? Do we do it because it feeds our soul and it's not really about social justice? Do we recognize that tension? For those who may be listening who don't want to travel and are still interested in social justice, would they find themselves at disadvantages for not wanting to, say, go to Houston or India or West Papua? There may be people who are differently abled, and so traveling for them is not a possibility. And of course, in the post-COVID, or in the context of COVID, we're still in COVID, we know that this is a changing landscape. So that was a useless question, but it was a comment, and I would love to hear your thoughts on it. And how about this time we start with Zoe, and then we go to Marcus, and then we do Indu.
So look, I think when I look at, I mean, Houston in so many ways for me was a positive indulgence. It was something that really pushed me out of my comfort zone. And it was something that I could do because I had the support of family and university and all of that. And I don't work in that exact space now. So what I have since discovered in doing the roles that I currently do is there are very clear things that we can do in our backyard that are really important. And when we're working with children and young people, your lived experience, or the lived experience of a person, is so incredibly valuable. So, you know, there are amazing councils that advise the New South Wales government in terms of disability access, in terms of sport, in terms of youth crime. And so sometimes I think we feel like we have to go big because there are so many big issues that we want to solve in this world. But what I have learned, and what I learned in doing my degree, is that poverty exists right here in my own backyard. Injustices are here as well. You know, the removal or the complete disregard for child rights, that's absolutely happening here. And that's not to say that I'm saying it's doom and gloom. What I'm saying is that social justice and advocacy and whatever it is can look like very different things. And it doesn't necessarily, in my view, mean you have to go abroad. I think it's always good to get inspiration from other places. And so to spend time connecting with people in other spaces who do work or have done things well or have done things differently. But with the world that we've lived in for the past 2 years, that can be done via Zoom. So I think it's important to learn from people around the world about the way they've designed systems. But I think there's still plenty to do right here. And so I don't think anyone should feel compelled that that has to be part of it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Zoe. Marcus, I think, was next. Yeah.
I kind of have two minds about this question. On the one hand, part of my role involves a bit of travel, and it's essential, I think, to international partnerships work. One of the things we do, for example, is get all of the partners together in one place, and we have workshops where we, update the latest kind of DFAT requirements on child protection, or how to do monitoring and evaluation well, or in my case, it's like how to collect better stories and do storytelling, and send us high-res photos instead of the bad ones off your phone or whatever. And part of the power of that is like the way that partners talk to one another and they share knowledge, and it kind of, we facilitate them coming together, and then they kind of get things done together. So somebody from West Timor, for example, will connect with someone from Timor-Leste, will connect with someone from Bali, and they'll all share what they're doing, what's working, what's not working, new ideas and things. And the incidental conversations that come out of that are really fascinating. And like just the car trips between places or whatever. Like one example is there was a Javanese guy, West Papuan, and somebody from Timor-Leste having a conversation where, I was driving them between a place, but their conversation was about like the Javanese person's mother was putting up West Papuan students in her apartment, and they were talking about the racism and things experienced by West Papuans in that context. And they were asking like, oh, well, how, like, why? Well, I asked, why is that? And they said, oh, well, they have this association with drinking and when they're away from home. And they had this really interesting conversation that led to, I guess, a lot of the core problems facing like West Papuans and but then also that like, I guess there's a critique of racism, but then also a critique of like Indonesian imperialism, and but it came through natural conversation things. So I think that travel and bringing people together is super, super important. But then at the same time, like so there's the experiential side where, you know, people can be changed and go on to make a huge difference, and these connections can be formed. But then on the other hand, it is quite a privileged thing to be able to go overseas, and not everybody gets to do it, you know, for work or at all. Like you know, through my work in the church and things, I keep meeting, say, young Indigenous people or even older Indigenous people who have never left the country, never, you know, like, you know, gotten a passport or got on a plane. So I think that there needs to be I guess, I don't know, like the Australian government is kind of looking like it's moving in the right direction with having, you know, Indigenous voice within their foreign policy, and having you know, an ambassador that's recognizing that other countries and other partners of Australia are really interested in just talking to Aboriginal people. Like they're not so interested in, you know, like the kind of wider, you know, cult. They want to, like, the real deal for them is Aboriginal people. So I think that that's an emerging thing. But then as well, like, instead of us going there, I also think that like bringing people here to have experiences of connection, and if they need to do advocacy and lobbying and things like that can be, what do you call it, held pretty tightly within quite white and privileged spaces. So yeah, like that's the two sides of, I guess, that I would answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think travel can be a privileged space, even if we're traveling to places that are considered parts of what we call the global South. It is nevertheless a privilege to be able to go. Indu, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this question of travel and what it does and what it means.
I think travel, as it's framed in social justice work, is deeply problematic and contentious. You know, we have to ask ourselves who gets to travel and why travel is a perk for some people and not others. So I have a very, very uncomfortable relationship with traveling for social justice work, particularly when people are traveling to represent the interests of people on the ground who've never traveled and who don't get to represent themselves. So I think, you know, maybe the question we should ask is, what is the purpose of travel and who is representing what? And, you know, why is it that the people who have that deepest experience are not able to represent their own experiences in international fora? So there is a kind of an intermediary, and I think it's a vestige of kind of colonial practice, is who gets to be the intermediary. And I also think the notion of traveling to learn, it's a wonderful experience, but it's the remit of very few in this world. The majority of the world doesn't get to have that experience. And so, I've always had a very uncomfortable relationship with, recreational travel aside, but travel for social justice and travel for international development. And I think the world is moving away and very much recognizing that people in communities that face issues should be equipped to deal with, pull the levers, meet people and do what's needed to secure their own futures. And the best thing the rest of us can do is release power and release resources to those communities and actually just move out of the way. So, you know, we have to be very careful in this industry about the self-perpetuating of doing good. And that's why I think that kind of examination, interrogations, really important. Might not make me terribly popular, I think, but I think it's an ongoing conversation. And, you know, Zoe's point about, it was a very, very clear decision point for me as well in my work, is I decided very early in my career that I would live where I worked. that, you know, I would want to be part of the community. I would want to care for the place. I want to care for the people, and that there is an ecology that you contribute to by living where you work. And I think working in the Indigenous sector has really kind of helped me articulate that and put shape to it. You know, they see themselves as custodians of a place. And I think in a world that is increasingly rootless and people can go anywhere and do anything and be anywhere and travel anywhere and work anywhere, the question is, what is your place? To which place do you have an obligation? And how do you establish roots in those places and build community in that place? And I think maybe if we come at it from that, then the issue of travel becomes lesser. Or the question of travel, not so much the issue, is who are you? Where is your place of belonging? To which place, you know, as Zoe said, what is your backyard to which you wish to contribute? And how do you locate yourself so that it's equitable? I think is a really important question for all of us in this sector to ask.
I love that question. I love the way you phrase that. And I will just say, again, not spruiking too much, but there's actually an article that we read in our Master of Social Justice about the dangers of volunteerism that I actually co-wrote with one of my former students about this very issue. We're certainly not the only ones to write about it. It's increasingly something that people are mindful of. And look, when I was in graduate school, we did not talk about those things. So I'm embarrassed to say I was one of those people that kind of thought I could solve the world by, you know, traveling for a couple of months in South America. So, but we learn as we go, and at least we're arming ourselves that way going forward. Okay, how about the next question being, I'm going to ask the what advice question now, not as the concluding one, but I think it's an important one to ask because we know that there are people that are on this call right now that are really figuring out, like, how do I get into this? I've now heard the exciting things. I've heard some of the tough parts. So now, yeah, I'd love you guys to think about, for those that would be asking that question, I want to do good in the world. What should I do? How about let's go Indu, Zoe, Marcus.
It's good. I would say, you know, there are lots and lots of ways to do good in the world. And I suppose a career in social equity, social justice, and for-purpose organizations gives that kind of alignment. It is a wonderful way to live, I think. But I think there has to be, the thing to ask yourselves is, there's reciprocity in it. So what is it that you can, what value can you add and how? So actually kind of think about, there's lots of work, there's lots of places to work, there's lots of kinds of work. I think what's useful is to ask yourself, you know, what skills, capabilities, particular value can you add that is unique to you? And then, you know, and it'll emerge over time. I certainly, you know, I've very much responded to things I've learned as I've worked, but that's been a really useful guiding question for me, is where is it that I can add the most value, and what can I do to enhance that constantly? Because if you're going to be doing this work, you really want to be giving more than you're kind of getting in return. There's a definite reciprocity in this work. So I think maybe that's something to consider, is you know, what value do you add? How can you continually work on that? And skill yourself up and work on your own capabilities, and, you know, where you're working and who you're working with, so that there is that constant giving back into the sector, because it gives all of us a great deal.
Yeah, if I can just follow up on that with you, Indu, because actually you're of the three, you're the one who was not my student. What, can you be specific? Like, when you graduated, were you thinking, I'm really good at analysis, or I am whiz on a spreadsheet? Like,
yeah, it's a really good question. So I was a whiz at spreadsheets. I mean, I'm a finance trained accountant. I did econometrics for my honors degree. I did economics for my first degree. So, you know, when I did my political economy degree, it was fascinating. It was like the world opened up, the world of economics, because, you know, it was about power in economic systems. And At the end of that degree, I was very clear that I was not going to relinquish the skills and capabilities that I had in finance and economics. And so I've always worked in very much harnessing my financial commercial capabilities and in roles where that is of value. So I've always, been grateful for that technical first phase of my career, because it provides me with a very unique value proposition to the social justice sector. And I kind of say, well, accounting can be kind of boring. I don't do accounting so much, but understanding financial viability is a very important skill. And I use it all the time. And I won't relinquish it because it's actually of great value to the work I do.
Yeah, that's great. And what I love that says, and I'll probably ask the follow-up question to the other two of you as well, is that a skill that may not sound like a social justice skill can absolutely be used in the social justice space. I think that's a really important question. We think about how to make a difference. Zoe.
So, I mean, I've struggled with this my entire career in terms of what makes you get into the places that you get into. I thought by doing law, I'd be a human rights lawyer. But what I would say is that for me, like my ability to just happily engage and want to be around people. So I consistently like learning, and I don't even mean the formality of learning, like again, if I don't know something and there's something really amazing that someone's written, then I'd love to read that. And then usually what happens is I go down a rabbit hole and stalk all of the things that they've done. And if they live in Sydney and they're free for a cup of coffee, then I'll have a cup of coffee. So I think for me, it is really, it's hard because I don't have a very clear path as to how I got into it, but I have pretty clear, for want of a better description, soul traits that I think is what happened when I got here. So and anyone who's gone through this, when I lost my father, I started to make very different decisions. I started to make decisions based on passion and things that I loved, as opposed to doing the things that I thought I was meant to do. Now, that doesn't mean I went out and bought a home or went and did all these things. It meant that I just started to go, well, I've always loved social justice and people know that about me. And wherever I've sat, I always get frustrated in a business or if they're not doing enough in that space. So I just started to make some different decisions, which also included massive leaps of faith and humility. I don't know everything, but the first job I got in the space was in the peak body for youth homelessness. And I'd never experienced youth homelessness, but do I believe that children should all have equal access to things and equity and the basics that the UN Charter says that they should have? Yeah, absolutely. Did I know about the UN Charter before I did Masters of Human Rights? No, but now I'm a great believer in it. So I would say that, and perhaps it's not the best advice, but if you've got a passion about something, see what's available. See if you can volunteer. See if you can be on a board. See if you can get involved in that space. And then secondly, never underestimate your lived experience. Your life, your journey, your story, that matters somewhere. You just got to find the place that's going to create space for you to have that voice.
I love that advice, Zoe, and I think it's really an important one for anyone listening, which is the whole no clear path. I mean, I already kind of said that in reference to Marcus, but and that's maybe sobering for people that are like, well, what should my path be? But I find it very freeing because it means you don't have to worry exactly that at this moment, the thing that you choose tomorrow is the thing that will determine where you're going to be in 20 years in making a difference in the world.
And I'd say, if I just said one last thing, don't worry about titles. Find organizations that you believe in and that you can see things that align with you. So even when I worked in the corporate space for Deloitte, they had just won Female Employer of the Year. And I thought, well, that's amazing. I want to have a conversation with them about that. So don't worry about the title. Find organizations where you can see value and see positive impact.
Love that. Thank you. Marcus.
Mine might be a little bit similar, but I guess my advice for people considering a similar path would be, like if you are passionate about this, like in the first instance, I would say it can be hugely rewarding. Like for me personally, I feel like, the whole journey has been a learning experience where I've like been wrong a lot of times. I've done bad work a lot of times. I've, sharpened things up. I've, and been able to connect with people around the world and been able to kind of, figure out what ideas of, I guess, partnership and solidarity and, and trying to check issues of privilege and, it's a kind of like, my second point of advice would probably be, it's a long game. Like, don't expect, I guess, like instantly A, be able to know everything, and B, be able to make a difference in like lots of different areas. For me, some advice I got was kind of like, find one area or like one thing that, you're really passionate about, and then like, become like, Zoe has said a similar thing, like find the thing and then let that kind of guide you. And for me, that was, West Papua. But it's opened up, I guess, like this whole organization that's doing, really good things in lots of different areas. But that passion, I guess, and that initial reason I wanted to work there has never really left. But probably more practically as well, the advice that I would give is just get a foot in the door of an organization. Like, it can be really tricky. Like, I graduated and I was like, I kind of want to do some stuff on West Papua. So I did a research master's degree just focusing on that, like after my human rights master's. And then was kind of just I was like working at JB Hi-Fi and like doing bits and pieces, like whatever, to kind of keep myself afloat. And then when a job came up at Uniting World, like I said, I didn't get it. Like, I got knocked back because I didn't have enough experience, but I did have comms experience, and there was a job going that, I was, able to do. So, and it's not just me, like the time I've been at Uniting Worlds, somebody has started out as like an admin worker, has just kind of cold called and been like, admin is my background, but I'm passionate about international development and just want to like, work there. And then she's gone from being an admin worker to an international program manager, was managing programs in like South Sudan and I think a couple in Indonesia. And then has moved on to another organization, like got headhunted because she was and that was in the course of about 4 years. So it's, I feel like it's definitely like a long game, but getting your foot in the door and just having a relationship is really important.
Thanks, Marcus. That's great. And I do want to just say, I am mindful, this has been kind of revealed again and again, that free internships are the privilege of the privileged. So it is often getting your foot in the door is really tricky if you have to do it for free. One of the advantages of a program like the Master of Social Justice is there is a vocational placement option, which means you do have to pay for your degree, but if you're in a degree like that, you can choose the vocational placement, which is a way to get your foot in the door. And also, just to add something to Marcus said, it doesn't mean that you end up at that organization, but I can tell you from outside, the amount that I learned just about the way organizations are structured by working within them, by being an intern within them, is unbelievably beneficial going forward. You say, oh wait, that's how procedures work in an organization, and that's the effect that it might have on the power in the organization, or the way that that organization gets its funding from outside. So we have only 10 minutes left, and I want to encourage any attendees. I have a few more questions, so we will not have silence. You don't have to worry about that. But we are very, very happy to hear questions from anyone that is out there. I really encourage you not to be shy. I think you can see that we have 3 really warm and wonderful panelists here who are really, really happy to speak to you. While we wait for those to come in, I did want to ask, I wanted to ask a question which we also cover, I have to say, in our master's program. So, Indu, you have worked with, among many things, you have worked with a really creative program that I'd love to hear more about, that brings migrant communities and indigenous communities together. No doubt there are joint stories of being removed from power in very profound ways. Zoe, you are at the pointy end of children who are in the most marginalized and powerless of spaces. And Marcus, you are working with a community that has been sort of asking for various degrees of autonomy and independence for more than 50 years. And I wanted to ask, by way of that, how you take care of yourselves. What are the impacts on your well-being when you are hearing those stories? I also want to say, I am mindful that it is often the case that you are thinking to yourself, why are you even asking me that question, Susan? The suffering of the people that I am working with is far greater than my own. And yet it is a question that we need to ask. What is the toll on your well-being and what do you do about it? Let's do Marcus and do Zoe.
I think like having good boundaries and then being able to like communicate to your organization or to your managers and team when things aren't going well, or you're like needing to have a mental health day or something like that, is really important. I guess that's how I would manage it. But then I would also say, like, in the nonprofit sector, because, or at least in my context, or in the context that I work, pay levels can be quite significantly less than. So in my mind, I feel like when that's the case, you almost have license to kind of speak more into like the organizational structure and be able to kind of like have more say and things, because it's like we kind of, we're all here because we're passionate about it. And, there's an attitude, I think, of like, you don't get to kind of, I don't know, like, not abuse it, but like, I don't know, have your cake and eat it too, in a sense, or like, so I guess just like, asserting power in the space that you're in, like, and acknowledging that, like, yeah, I don't know if I'm communicating this effectively.
It makes sense. In some organizations that is possible, in others it may be harder.
Yeah, we try to have like a more flat structure so we can all, but part of that is the understanding, I think, that we're all here because of passion, and it's not necessarily like we're not making money and things, we're here because we believe in the work and stuff. So taking the opportunity, I think, to be part of, I guess, the upper level leadership discussions and like how we want things to be structured, like that being super important to both me and being welcomed in the organization.
Thanks.
But sometimes it needs asserting.
Thanks. Indu.
Look, I think two things. Probably one is humility helps a lot, and remembering that the work will go on even if you're not there, because it always does. And so really for you to kind of wind back or do what's needed so that you can bring balance and therefore bring your best self to work is, that's one kind of way to think about it. The other is actually, as I've become more senior, is you want to be role modeling balance as leader in an organization. And, I think if we work in social justice and in social equity, the reason we're doing it is so that people can have full lives, lives that where they can enjoy their communities, they can enjoy their families, they can enjoy cultural life. And I actually think it's important to model that if you work in the sector. So I always think, it's important that I fulfill my obligations and the joy I get from family and community and cultural life. And in some ways that balance actually brings a lightness. You've got to have, this is hard work, and actually you've got to have fun. Otherwise it can be terribly, terribly, terribly dull. And I think I came into kind of my humor a bit later in life. I was quite kind of serious and task oriented in my earlier career, but I think the balance brings lightness, it brings humor, it brings joy, it brings good relationships in the work environment in which you're spending a lot of time. And I think that actually makes work more sustainable and relationships endurable, that endure beyond that job, right? Because you're having fun with people, and you can, it's a way of relieving the pressure of the work you're doing and what you're seeing and what you're kind of enduring because of the nature of the work. So I'd say, you know, a bit of humility, and then remember that we're in this work because we believe in a way of living that is balanced, and it means we have to model that, particularly those of us who have that privilege.
I'm going to cut you off only because we have a question and I want to make sure we get to it. So Zoe, let me have your very quick answer to that, and then let's do this question we've had, because it's a great one.
And I'm deeply protective of it. So I exercise 5 mornings a week. I will call it, yesterday I went to a youth justice facility, and one of the young people there I do a lot of work with wasn't well. So I didn't work for the afternoon. I spent my time reflecting on that. So I actually am very selfish of that, and I'm incredibly vulnerable. And Marcus, I know no boundaries. So that's part of my problem as I've got into this job, and I don't take myself too seriously. I've had to start setting some boundaries. But then I also I've called 2 days off in the next 2 weeks, because it's just, I've recognized that I've got to a point and I need to have a bit of a break.
Well, we're grateful that you didn't do that for this, because it's been so great to have you. So the question is, thank you. It's been fantastic to hear from you. I just wanted to ask you, what is the role of social justice related research? Has it added a particular value in the organizations you work in? I'm afraid I'm going to ask each of you to do like a 20-second answer. 30 seconds, fine. Okay. Indu first, Marcus, then Zoe.
Look, I think social justice research can be very useful. You need people in organizations that are skilled in working with the research sector so that you can deliver evidence-based practice. Often NGOs don't have capability to build that relationship and turn research into evidence-based practice. So it's always a bit of a challenge when it comes to resourcing, but there's certainly value in it. And you've just got to find the right relationships in the NGO sector through whom you can, with whom you can work.
That's great, Indy, thanks. Zoe, I can't remember who I said now.
For us, in its formal sense, we absolutely use it, but we start, all of our social justice research starts with children and young people and asking them what matters to them and what they need.
That's great, thanks. Marcus?
Just anecdotally, in my context, the research that I did for my master's program, I have gotten to use, just, I guess, in the sense of, we sometimes write like framework papers for advocacy that we use to kind of get people on board with an issue, and West Papua is part of that. And then we also like write letters to the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, like pretty regularly, often on West Papua. So having a research basis from which to kind of proceed, I think helps.
Yep.
But it's kind of incidental, but so it's there, it's incidental.
And I'll just say, as the director of the Master of Social Justice, it's a mix for us between trying to teach skills and trying to make sure that students do research that's both theoretical and practical. Both end up being useful. The theoretical can help us to have the concepts that underlie what kind of we understand to be the problems in the world. And then the practical is kind of, you know, what research that says, what is the best way to do an interview? Well, you need to do research to even know that, for example. Or what are the best ways to work in a group if you have to do group collaboration? And those are the kinds of things we do. I cannot believe how quickly this hour flew. I want to say that if we were in person, this would be the point pre-COVID at which I would embrace each of you and give you some kind of a gift, a University of Sydney snow globe or a book. What I am to do is just enthusiastically thank you for such an honest and rich reflection of the work that you do. I will be emailing all three of you to take you out for coffee, so I get to hear more. I also want to thank our attendees for staying on. I've been tracking. I'm sorry there weren't more questions, but you've stuck with us the whole time. So we must have done something right in not having you talk too much about yourselves just at the beginning. And I hope that we get to do more events like this. It's been really a privilege for me to hear from all of you. Thank you to all of you for coming, and we'll close it off now.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
I know.